Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm joined by UKBGF board member and experienced tournament director Andrew Selby. You might know him from some prestigious London events. He also has a London Backgammon League. Welcome to my channel, Andrew. Thanks for coming.
Thank you for having me, Daniel. Good evening all.
Good evening. Now today we are going to look at the rules of the game, and by that we mean the official Backgammon rules, which you can find online, and these are the latest version 2015. I will also put a link in the video description so you can check these out afterwards. We're going to do a 15 quiz questions, so have a pen and paper ready, and then we will talk about the official rules after each question. Now, Andrew, before we start, anything you would like to add about these rules?
As I said, if we go back in time, backgammon, one of the oldest board games in the world, 5,000 years ago, supposedly shown to have been played in, I think, Iraq. Prior to 2014, I would say the only rules of backgammon that existed were best reflected in an analogy of Warren Buffett on life generally, which was the first rule is not to lose. The second rule is not to forget the first rule. As a result, there were no rules. In 2014, when the UKBGF board was formed, a rules and ethics committee went in parallel, driven by Raj Gansari and some selfless other parties, including Peter Bennett, Tony Lezard, and forgive me the others. They created a set of rules that are now in front of you that have formed the foundations actually of tournament backgammon around the world. They've been adopted by the World Backgammon Federation and numerous other federations, and it's actually one of the most wonderful legacies that UK backgammon has given to the world is the set of rules. So for all of us today, in a funny sense, quite humbling to go through the rules. You should also look at them positively. They're fairly small in quantum and they're easily digestible. You're not going to be sat with a quantum of pages and small text and conditions. And I do say to you all, look at the link. It's only, I think it's only about 15 to 20 A4 pages in pretty bold, large font. And absolutely as a prerequisite to anybody at any level in the game to just read, remind themselves or educate them. So hopefully today will just be a good intro. We'll try and touch on a few of the key elements that come up when Daniel and I experience certainly tournament backgammon generally. But from that point forth, as is so much within the governance of backgammon, personal responsibility kicks in and you need to know the rules.
Yes, you might be going to your first ever tournament. Maybe it's one of Andrew's tournaments in London, and it's worth spending a little bit of time kind of reading the rules in advance so you kind of know them. Really, you take some responsibility for playing at a tournament level. So let's get started then. So question number one. Now, how many times must you shake the dice? Now, all of the questions will be multiple choice, A, B, or C. So one good shake is enough. You must shake the dice a minimum of 3 times or 5 times. Now, Andrew, what's the answer?
So Daniel, I know, is a big fan and follows the mantras of Mahatma Gandhi, who once said, you should all remember that in a gentle way you can shake the world. Jon Barnes, who's done a wonderful video on probably the biggest bugbear in backgammon, of dice shaking and rolling, actually said you should do it 3 times and vigorously. So although there isn't a defined number, the general rule of thumb is 3 good shakes and a sensible release of the dice across the board, not a little plop onto the table, and you're fine. But I would say of all my tournament directing requests from players, frustrations, opponents not shaking the dice is probably the most common.
Absolutely. Now, if you stop the quiz now and got this one right, and then applied this to every tournament, the world would be a better place, and you'd save Andrew another TD's a headache, I'm sure.
And my hair would grow back.
Your hair would go. Yes, Andrew is completely right. Of course, a valid roll consists of the dice being shaken vigorously, but not excessively. Now, there is no official number of shakes, I should say, but we take the adverb vigorously to mean 3 and excessively to mean more than 3. Because, of course, if you roll the dice, you shake the dice excessively, then the dice are just going to fly off the board, and then you're going to be under the table looking for your expensive precision dice, which no one wants to do mid-game. This is taken from 4.1 in the official rules, by the way. Let's continue. Number 2, if the dice touch your hand before landing on the board, is this A, a legal roll if the dice land flat, an illegal roll, or a clear example of cheating? Andrew.
Okay, so it is an illegal roll. I can't imagine many instances where you would roll the dice and it would hit your own hand before landing. Save, a lot of people do accidentally keep their hand over the dice cup before when they release, and it can accidentally touch your fingers on its route down. So you would have to re-roll. What can happen more pertinently is your dice roll could actually hit your opponent's hand, or in vigorous extremes can hit the board, jump over the lip of the board and hit your opponent, but then find itself back on the board in a legal position on the right side of the board. It's an interesting one because it came up at my memorial tournament earlier this year, and I had to call a ruling committee over because I actually did not know the answer. The answer is that if the opponent's hand stays stationary and does not move towards the dice or seemingly change the trajectory deliberately or not, then the roll is still valid, amazingly. And I didn't know that. So quite interesting that it's illegal if it hits your own hand, but if it hits your opponent's hand but doesn't actually change the roll of the dice, then that's fine.
Great. Let's look at the official ruling on that. So here, again, 4.1. As the dice are being rolled, they should not touch the player's hand, and the cup should not touch the board. So your cup, your shaker, should not hit the board. There should be no interference in the dice. Now, a lot of players play with a baffle box, which you might have seen, which again, you drop the dice in, and then they have no contact at all with your hand besides you dropping them in the top of the box. And also, going back to the first point, when you shake the dice, like you said, Andrew, they should roll freely across the board. You shouldn't just drop them from a great height and then they just plonk down. Again, that kind of can annoy other players by not doing it correctly. And it takes a while to get used. If you're new to backgammon, I think, Andrew, actually shaking and rolling the dice, it's something you have to kind of practice at, would you say, a little bit?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because you see some flamboyancy with now more experienced players that have evolved their dice rolling into an art form. You're probably right. I think it's actually underestimated that it's not as simple an act as it sounds.
That's right. You might be used to playing on a larger board. I mean, you play on a slightly smaller board, and then the dice, don't go where they should.
Yeah, or depth of shakers. Nice, long, deep shaker is easy to vigorously shake, release from. Sometimes some of the shakers are very shallow.
Good point. Yeah, so now number 3, can I roll on both sides of the backgammon board? So yes, anytime. No, never. Yes, but only after asking the opponent's permission. Andrew?
So you need to ask your opponent's permission. And this is quite a normal scenario in a match where if you're both bearing off, for example, on the right-hand side of the board where you would be rolling normally, and all 30 checkers remain in their bear-off position, there won't be much room for the dice to roll, and certainly not to roll freely. So you would ask your opponent if it's all right, can I roll on your side of the board? As long as the opponent says fine, no reason to think they wouldn't, that's completely fine. You should be aware that permission actually stands until they withdraw it. So you can keep rolling on that side for as long as you like in the bear-off, even when the checkers are clearly emptying off the right-hand side of the board and space reappears. But in the unlikely event your opponent says, look, could you now please re-roll on your side of the board, then you would have to.
Absolutely. And it's worth adding, if you were to roll on the wrong side of a board without the permission, then the roll will be illegal, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So here we are. Valid rolls. Generally, all rolls must be made on the right-hand side of the bar, unless, as Andrew said, you have your opponent's permission. Now, another common one, what happens if the dice, once rolled, don't land flat? A, they are cocked, roll again. B, wait patiently for the dice to land properly and play on. Or C, knock the board a bit to help them land properly. What do you think?
The answer is A, of course. You would have to roll again. Fortunately, we don't play by USBGF rules where the dice sitting on other players or on your checkers or other players' checkers could potentially still play. And then you have more of an ability to see cocked dice with more margin. On these ones, if the dice are clearly angled and not flat, then you re-roll. One thing to bear in mind, and I see it because the UKBGF boards have these inlays, is sometimes the inlays aren't particularly flat on boards. And it looks like the dice are cocked, but actually if the inlay is not flat, that doesn't mean the dice are cocked. So on a regular board, cocked dice is very evident, and if it's not flat on the surface, it is an illegal roll. There is a very rare exception where if the board is old and a little bit crumpled or has an inlay, it's not illegal if it's shown at an angle but lying flat on an angle of an inlay.
Yes.
I only say that because a lot of UKBGF tour events use the UKBGF boards with not particularly flat inlays. And I've been asked that question a lot.
Yeah. And also, if the dice are cocked for a moment and then they fall flat of their own volition, then that is still legal, right, Andrew?
Yes. I mean, it's one of these ones like golf, when the ball drops in the hole, how long do you wait? I don't think there is a time limit. I think, it's one of those ones. I did an illegal roll playing a match recently in the Cambridge Open with Andy Darby, where I rolled, and it wasn't cocked, but my dice was still spinning. And I actually assumed it was about to be an illegal roll. So I cocked and picked it up before it had finished the spinning. So I did the reverse. In this instance, you can wait for a second or two, and if it falls down flat, that's perfect. But clearly, if you've then both said it's cocked and then it happens, that's too late.
Yeah, of course. And if the dice are spinning for what seems like ages and you bang the table, then it becomes illegal, the roll.
Absolutely.
Because again, the intervention is not good. So be patient. Practice the art of patience.
Not a virtue among many backgammon players.
The dice must roll freely and come to rest lying flat on the playing surface of the board to the roller's right of the bar. And as you said, in America, they do have a dice on checker rule, don't they? Which is slightly different. Do you think that will come into the UK, the dice on checker rule?
No, is the honest answer. I think the stopping of clock when you have illegal rolls or the like is a frustration for some people. Maybe you should be penalised for your illegal roll. But then you have grey areas. What happens if, as we see often, the dice actually leave the table and you need to find them? So I think for the moment, the status quo on that one will stay the same. And it's not a particularly important rule other than knowing a cocked dice is an illegal throw.
Okay. Now this is one which again comes up a lot, and I see it time and time again. Can I move checkers with both hands? Yes, but only one hand at once. No, never. You must only use one hand at once throughout the game. Yes, no problem. Don't worry about it.
I look at an analogy on this one, and that will help people know the answer, which is I play with one hand but fight with both. So it's just one hand.
It's one hand at once, yeah. So it's both A and B there. I think I've just worded them slightly different.
I mean, you could take the George Martin Game of Thrones quote that the gods give with one hand and take with the other, which would probably be quite apt for backgammon. But if that helps you remind you, but yeah, please, only one hand.
That's right. Here we see in the official rules, players must move clearly and use only one hand at once to move a checkers. Now, if you do switch between one hand, then the other hand, then that is acceptable. What's not acceptable is when there's two hands moving across the board and it's confusing. You don't know where their hands are going, and that's when things can happen. Witchcraft. So, we don't like it. I want to know what my opponent's doing with his checkers. Yeah. And repeated transgressions, we can talk about later. So again, following on about checker rules, and there are many rules to do with moving, touching checkers. So can I touch checkers on my opponent's turn? So if I were playing you, Andrew, and it was your turn, could I touch any checkers when you were playing?
No. So the answer to that one is obviously a very clear no. So when it's not your turn, just sit on your hands if you're an impulsive person that gets itchy fingers. But no, you categorically cannot touch your opponent's checkers while it's their turn. So that one should be a pretty simple one to uphold.
Absolutely. So a player should not touch his own checkers, even his own checkers, or his opponent's during his opponent's turn. So you shouldn't really be doing much during your opponent's turn. You certainly shouldn't be touching the board, the checkers, the dice, nothing. Just wait. Be patient.
Absolutely.
And even, things like calling numbers, it's frowned upon. These kind of interrupting plays, which can be seen to maybe knock your opponent's focus.
I think that brings up a point for another day, which is the code of conduct, which has been brought in parallel, and kudos to John McNeil, who emigrated and left us as chairman during his tenure. But the code of conduct will offer an element of control, I think, in the future over sportsmanship and what is right and wrong in terms of etiquette of the game. And I would almost argue that's probably as important as the rules.
Absolutely. And I know that Phil Simborg has written a number of amusing posts on social media about these kind of etiquette rules, about stop complaining about your bad luck. I don't care.
Oh, absolutely.
And it's just a politeness of the game. Okay, so number 7, Andrew, repeated checker shuffling to try out moves. For instance, if you have a double, it's allowed if you are confident on the original position. It's not allowed and can result in warnings. And it's allowed if you lift the checkers slightly to show that they have moved.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because there's a sort of a vagary there in the answers, as there is with the whole issue of shuffling. I mean, we were saying dice rolling is probably the most common complaint to tournament directors. Checker shuffling wouldn't be far off being a close second. The biggest frustration is most matches aren't recorded, and therefore for a tournament director to be called over when two players can't remember the starting position is both unfair on the tournament director and actually very unfair on the opponent who hasn't been moving the checkers.
Right.
And I'm sure I speak for both of us, where the more experienced players have to spend a lot of time concentrating against lesser experienced players, who get into a bad habit of this where they don't remember where they were, and we're having to keep consciousness and control of where they were from their starting point.
Yes.
The irony being you've got this whole grey area anyway of illegal moves and starting positions, and it's often the opponent's responsibility to actually remember or see all these issues. So the key is in an uncontrolled manner, if I remember rightly on the ruling. So the answer is you can shuffle, but not in an uncontrolled manner. And therefore, one of the things that we would advocate if you do move your checkers is to try and disassociate them from the other checkers on the board by just setting them slightly above and apart. So at least you know where they're going to go back in number terms, because it's often on doubles where the confusion lies.
Yeah.
So the answer is you can shuffle. You need to do it in a controlled manner. Of course, if you remember the original position, it's allowed. That's a given. If you forget the original position, you're going to get a stern warning from someone like me to not do it again.
Yes.
And backgammon warnings, the first warnings are generally pretty light-hearted. The second warning is the precursor to a punishment. So, don't be too upset if you ever get a first warning at a tournament. It's a 3-strike and a real penalty in backgammon. But normally players are pretty good at saying to you, come on, be more careful. C is probably the one I would lean towards, because I'd rather see players allowed to do it, but by lifting the checkers and associating them or disassociating them from the bar points that exist. So it's very clear which pieces have been moved.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's a good habit to get into, and I do it myself, just lifting the checkers just a fraction, so if you play, so you know where they are. What happens, Andrew, in the instance that both players can't remember the original position? What happens?
It's very difficult. They either have to come to an agreement, or in some instances I've seen them just have to restart that game.
Wow, okay.
But in reality, there would be a very firm warning for the player who has offended in that instance. In fact, I'm yet to find an instance where they haven't found their way back by just retracing their steps. And sometimes it's the old adage, you can't see the wood through the trees. Once a tournament director comes over and you're sort of less focused with the intensity of your opponent, you tend to find your way back and remember your last rolls. But in reality, in a worst case scenario, I could see you having to replay the game with a huge warning for the player that's offended.
Interesting. Okay, so this is an interesting one. So if a spectator notices an illegal move, so maybe you're watching a match as a spectator, can you intervene as a spectator? So absolutely not. Yes, you must as a spectator, or yes, but only after consulting the tournament director.
Okay, so to those less experienced, you'll hear the terminology Kibitzer, a German word. I think it's people who used to watch over the shoulders of people playing cards and give unwelcome advice, or welcome advice to those who needed it. So the idea is that clearly there are more and more people spectating at tournaments, watching matches they're not involved with, who are not either tournament directors or referees. And as such, they aren't able to be directly involved if they notice something. What they are able to do is go and find the tournament directors, or if there is a very visible tournament referee, tap them on the shoulder and say that I've seen something, and let the tournament referee or director decide whether that's worthy of stopping the clocks and informing the players. But no, they can't speak directly to the players for obvious reasons. That could create collusion in a match between a player and a friend of his. But kibitzers, in light of recent tournament events, can be an important part of just seeing some sort of illegal move that's just been genuinely missed by players. And we all know we miss them, even the most experienced. So it would be nice to know that they've got a way of transferring what they've seen to third parties. There are tournaments, by the way, that do allow kibitzing. I think Chris Purchase's St Albans Open, you can have a flag on your table that allows spectators to comment if they see it. But it's only in that rare exception where a tournament director has created an option to allow it that it does exist. Under UKBGF rules alone, no, they've just got to find a credible third party, which is just the referee or tournament directors or members of ruling committees.
Yeah, and also this links to code of conduct, as we did mention earlier, that if you are spectating a match, and I was recently in the Midlands Open final and there were about 15-20 people watching, it's really important that you keep quiet, and you don't talk about the roles. And so if you are watching, I mean, there is a kind of a manner to conduct yourself which doesn't distract other players. So worth bearing that in mind as well. And also it is good, if you can, to spectate players. If you're new, watching matches live is a great use of time at a tournament.
But the contrary to that is why we always have all promoted chouettes as a great learning curve, where you can consult and speak about moves, and that often is the best education.
Absolutely. Only the players, the tournament director, and any other official match monitors are required to point out an illegal move. Okay. Now, this one, rolling prematurely. Now, if you roll prematurely before your opponent has picked up their dice and ended their turn, what happens? So the roll doesn't count, the roll stands, or the TD decides on the best action.
A classic over haste never makes speed. What can I say to players? He who goes slowly goes safely. All of us get caught up in the excitement, the exuberance, the intensity of the game of backgammon. And I'm sure we've all been guilty from time to time, if you're not playing on the clock where there is only one set of dice, that we roll a little bit too quickly. The bottom line is your opponent is able to leave that as a valid roll on the table. Well, it is a valid roll. It stays on the table and he could adjust his move accordingly. So your penalty is that you're giving your opponent sight of your roll, but the roll itself is valid.
Yeah, I think like the only time you might see this is maybe in a bear-off position, where people do tend to roll a bit quicker, don't they? When they just ripping the checkers off. But even like some people, and I see this a lot in tournaments, they roll before you've hit the clock.
Another frustration, because you can actually put the clock back on the time. You can readjust your clock.
Yeah, you see.
Yeah, I know. I think one set of dice is the answer to all of this. And again, if we were talking about potential rule changes, certainly within tournaments where if clocks are not mandatory, at least trying to sort of create a process of less confusion, one set of dice would avoid a lot of this.
Yeah, agreed. So here we have it. The roll shall stand if a player rolls a dice before his opponent has finished his turn. 4.1. Now, this is something that actually happened to me in Brighton. I started a game with 14 checkers, unbelievably. Must have been a little tired. So if you do start the game with 14 checkers, what happens? So you finish the game with 14 checkers. You can only add the 15th checker if noticed before your opponent's second turn, or you can add the checker back anytime you like within the game.
So sometimes in life, all you need is a second chance if you weren't ready for the first one. So the answer is that once your opponent's second turn has completed, that's it, and you have to play on for the rest of the game with 14 checkers. So you need to notice pretty darn quickly.
Yeah, absolutely. And this can happen because sometimes when you're bearing off checkers, maybe you don't bear them off into the tray, maybe you bear them off to the side of a board. And yes, it happened to me.
It does happen. It's happened again. All of these things happen to all of us, without exception.
Yeah, and here it is stated here. And you know, the nice thing about these official rules is they are not written in jargon or legalese. I mean, they're written in a very easy to understand manner, um, in short paragraphs that you can just digest, and then you know. So if an error in the starting position is noticed after a player starting the game has commenced his second turn, by making a valid roll or offering a valid double, the starting position is valid in spite of the error. There we are. So yes, be careful when you set up the board. So number 11, can you change the dice mid-game? Yes, if in agreement with the opponent. No, not at all. Yes, but you must ask the tournament director first.
So that's actually a hybrid of A and B, because I believe the only dice you can change mid-game are precision dice, unless they're damaged. So any equipment can be changed during a game if it's damaged. That would even extend to a clock, obviously, if all of a sudden the batteries went, as a good example. If the lip of a dice shaker breaks, good example, again, that could be changed. Dice, in the unlikely event something happened, they were broken. But I think in terms of changing dice mid-game, and this is quite an interesting one, because you do get a lot of players who believe in bad luck, and often sort of during the game are going, oh, I want to change to the other pair of precision dice. You can only change the dice, as say, if initially you start with non-precision dice, and then if during the game someone says, oh, I could lend you some precision dice, then my understanding is that is actually mandatory and you can switch. But I think in any other instance, no.
Yeah, completely right. Yeah, so the tournament director may change the equipment at any time if they are faulty or defective, but if precision dice become available even during the game, then they can be switched out. And you know, precision dice are expensive. It's about £10 for one die nowadays, but you really should get a set of precision dice if you're going to be going to tournaments. I personally really don't want to play a tournament match without precision dice, and I think many players would be the same. Andrew, how do you feel about people without precision dice?
I think the answer is we're all in agreement that non-precision dice could be weighted to a fault. They could be weighted to a point where actually, quite genuinely, a certain side of the dice consistently comes up. That's not because your opponent is cheating using them, it's just the weight of the dice. So precision dice alleviate all that concern. They're equitably balanced on all six sides. So for sure in tournaments, it's compulsory. You have to play with precision dice.
Absolutely. And there's a few extras we could say here. So usually when you are playing with 4 precision dice, then your opponent chooses which colour die first they want to use, and then you choose a second one. And you usually pick one of each colour. If there's 2 pinks and 2 whites, you'd have 1 pink and 1 white each, right?
Agreed.
It kind of goes like that. And sometimes, some precision dice are tiny. And, the
13.5 millimeters. Yeah.
And, the opponent might say, well, I can't read the die. So, then you would maybe consider changing them to a larger set, for example. So, yes, there we are. Number 12. Now, whose responsibility is it for alerting opponent that their clock is running down? So the clock is only the player on roll's responsibility. The opponent whose clock time isn't running down should tell the player, or anybody, any spectator of the game. Yeah.
So this is one of these sort of paradoxes we were talking about earlier with legal, illegal moves, etc. The responsibility is actually on the opponent to notify you, be it morally, ethically, or legally, that your clock is running down. There are instances, I've had a number of them as tournament directors, where players have lost on a clock that's run down. I've only been called over at the end of a match, and obviously I have no way of knowing why that happened. Invariably it's happened because the players have failed to stop the clock in between games, which is a big failing. my personal belief on all of this is you never put the key to your own success in someone else's pocket. It's up to you to make sure of your own clock, but the responsibility is actually on your opponent to notify you. I've always felt that the top players, without patronising the lesser players in backgammon, are very generous consistently in highlighting any issues for lesser players to ensure they don't get themselves into trouble. And I'd say the clock is probably the most common where top players are reminding lesser players that their clocks are beginning to run down and be careful. But it is the opponent's responsibility, but I will go back to it that at the end of a match, if the clock's run out and you've lost, and the tournament director has no way of knowing why that has happened, it's very unlikely you're going to rule against the opponent for not notifying you, save if it's very clear that he didn't. So it's one of these ones. In my mind, it's personal responsibility, and it's up to you to be responsible for your own clock. However, certainly if you're an inexperienced player, that might be a bit unfair. But the reality is the opponent should tell you. Yeah,
and there is a gentleman's rule that you should notify your opponent. So I played Sue Parks in a recent London tournament, and we were about halfway through the match, and she had about a minute on her clock. So I just said, look, be mindful, you're running low on your clock. When in actual fact, I could have said nothing and let her lose on time, but it's not the right thing to do, ethically, morally.
And within the rules. Within the rules, So but it's very hard to prove as a tournament director. So I go back to it. Just always be conscious of your own clock. Stop at the end of the game and make sure it's been paused. It may not be you pausing the clock. Your opponent may have paused the clock because they forfeited the game, or refused the cube and paused it. Just be sure it has been paused, because whether innocently or not, sometimes that pause hasn't been paused.
Absolutely, and sometimes there's different clocks. You might be using a clock that you're not particularly used to. There's different models.
Very much so. The digital, these digital touch ones are very sensitive.
Absolutely.
The more traditional chess clocks are much easier to visibly push, more robustly.
I think in addition to this as well, as we said earlier, if your dice drop off the table, then it is the right thing to do to pause the clock. Your opponent pauses the clock.
For sure.
And even if your dice are cocked, it's very common that they will give you your delay time back.
You see a lot of players banging their opponent's clock to save them the time on an illegal roll, even though it's obviously only a fraction of a second.
Yeah, it's a nice thing to do. Okay. Now, number 13. If a match has been completed to the wrong match length, what happens? The players have a single game to decide the outcome. The extra points must be played, or the match win stands. The length can only be changed when the match is in progress, if this is at all possible.
Yeah, again, very, very, very common, surprisingly. More so when you're playing in a lot of the modern tournaments that if they're not Swiss, they tend to be double eliminators where you have a different point level in the undefeated and the fighters brackets. And people therefore sometimes get a bit confused and they're playing to the wrong points. The answer is C. So the results, if you finish a match to 7 points and it should have been to 9, the minute it's finished at 7 and you've shaken hands, left the table, that's it, it's over. If at any point prior to the last roll of the dice, quite literally, someone points out that it's actually 9 to each other, you can adjust it.
There we have it, where a match has been played and concluded to an incorrect match length, such result shall stand. However, in progress, shall be corrected at the beginning of the next game if possible. And this is the player's responsibility. So if you are at a 2-day tournament and you go from the main to the consolation to the last chance, then the match length often changes from maybe an 11 to a 9.
Well, it does change,
so you should know. And if you don't know, then ask someone at the desk before you start. There is a level of responsibility on the player to know this information.
I think if a tournament director said what's their biggest frustration, is no one listening to their welcoming speech. There's always pointed out.
There was some talk of that online about having a kind of a speech at the beginning to remind people of what we're doing today, Andrew. These are the rules. This is how you roll. This is how you do this.
I actually, it's interesting to say that because you'll see it at the Players' Championship. I've got 20, I call it bullet key points, just because, all our attention spans won't last, beyond something less than that, or more than that. So, I agree. I think even to the point of highlighting to people the Kibitza rule, who is the ruling committee? One thing players are very unaware of is appealing decisions or unsure on rulings. And if they get a ruling and they think it's not a good ruling, what can they do? So there are processes that, in truth, people are unsure of. And the UKBGF rules govern most of them. Some are very personal to tournament directors. So there are rules that you can create within the rules. I think we're about to come to one in a short while. So no, it's a very valid point, and I think people do need to be reminded before an event of the key elements that we're going to ask of each other. And if we do, we'll be fine.
That's right, a refresher. So we got 2 more questions to go. Number 14 is, how many breaks may a player take during an 11-point match? So 1 5-minute break, 1 10-minute break, or as many as he likes to get snacks, use a toilet, phone friends. Andrew.
So this is a good example, actually, of why you need to know the rules, because this is probably the kind of thing a tournament director might not mention. It just might slip through the net. So if the tournament is being played under UKBGF rules, which generally it is, then I think it's 1 minute. It's 1 5-minute break for an 11-point match. I think it extends slightly for a longer match. But a lot of tournament directors have their own personal rules with regard to not just actually 5-minute breaks, but also to penalties for late attendance.
Right.
Which, again, you'll see at the Players' Championship. I have a slightly different rule to the UKBGF rule of 1 point every 5 minutes late. I prefer the rule we actually have on Backgammon Hub with Alfie, which is when your match is called, you have 15 minutes grace, and at 15 minutes and 1 second, if you're not in your seat, you forfeit. So
I think it's really important because tournaments run on a very tight schedule.
That's why.
And now they have table numbers, so there's really no excuse not to be at a table. And if you are late by over 15 minutes, then the match starts 1-0 to your opponent, basically.
Under UKBGF, my rules are slightly more penal because for that reason, if it's a longer event and you've got the grace period, but there is no excuse other than if someone's physically left the building without telling us and without being rude. More fool them, you just don't do it.
Absolutely. And also to add to this, the break can't be in the middle of a game. The break is between individual games, because otherwise you could end up in like a really complicated back game position. 5 minutes, go to the toilet, put XG on your phone. No.
Well, it sounds like Queen's Gambit when she went in the toilet to understand what was going wrong in the middle of a game. That felt like cheating.
Absolutely. And again, it plays into the code of conduct. Punctuality is important, for an efficient running tournament and to keep everyone happy, throughout the day. And Andrew, you do a fabulous job of running tournaments. Let me add, I've been to a number of your tournaments in London, and they're always fun and well-run events.
Very kind.
So here we are.
Because I've got David Potter.
Yes. Also, let's not forget him. In matches up to 15 minutes, 1 5-minute break. Yes.
So more than 15 points is when they add a break.
So each player could take a 5 minute break in a match.
Mhm.
That's how it works, right?
Yeah.
Um, yeah. So this is a good one to know. Um, and then let's just go to the last one. About the doubling cube. Now, there are a number of rules regarding the cube, which again are in the official rules. You can look that up afterwards. The doubling cube is activated by pointing towards it or reaching for it. So, yes, but only if the cube has actually been physically touched. No, never. And yes, regardless of whether or not the cube has been touched.
Yeah, so frustratingly, something that became evident at a tour event last year. So this ruling did actually come into effect in a final, actually, I believe. The answer is C. So the intention, either physical or verbal, is sufficient for a double to be activated. So even if you haven't reached towards it and I say to you, I'm doubling you, that is it. That is the verbal act that you are contractually committing to. The physical act can be, I believe, as subtle as just pointing towards the doubling dice, as it is to potentially reaching to it and then pulling your arm back, thinking actually that was a bit impulsive. Any movement physically towards the doubling dice that shows an intent that you're going to double, that's it. You're past the point of no return, and certainly verbally for sure.
Absolutely.
So don't think that someone actually has to pick up the dice and put it on the table for you to be cubed. That is sufficient.
Absolutely. And here we have it, the demonstration of an intention to double, including by reaching for, pointing at, touching, picking up, shall be deemed a valid double. So this is worth bearing in mind, really, because like you said, Andrew, it does happen. All these things happen. All the 15 scenarios.
They've all happened at meaningful times in meaningful events to experienced players. So that this isn't being put out there just for inexperienced or novice players.
Yeah, and there's a lot of other things we could have added, like things like handshakes. It is gentlemanly to shake your opponent's hand before the match starts and after it ends, even if you lose 11-0 and your opponent has the best dice ever. Shake their hand before you leave the table. Don't be.
I always say it's better to lose 11-0 than on DMP on the last roll. So I look at it optimistically. I say I'd rather have lost 11-0 than 11-10.
Well, I mean, it's a great community of players, the backgammon scene in the UK, you play some brilliant people, so just be civil and polite. What other things can we mention that we haven't come across? Anything else, Andrew, do you think?
No, I think there will be lessons learned, as we all know, from recent scenarios in prestige UK events. There will be an evolution, not a revolution of rules.
Yeah.
But what I will say to anyone, and again, talking to experienced players or not, never be embarrassed to impose the rules. I think the experienced players are probably more at fault for that than the inexperienced players, because we do try, dare I say, to adhere more to a code of conduct than the rules of the game. I think we feel there's a moral responsibility for us not to impose upon less experienced players, even though they may have broken the rules. We're actually wrong. I think where it's code of conduct, that's fine. That's a separate issue. I think where the rules of the game are, the process isn't that penal. It's a warning. Then it starts being penal. But actually, if there's lessons learned over the last few months from what I've seen on the UKBGF, is had warnings been issued, I don't think the final warning/penalties would have ever existed, because from what I can see, wherever we have administered warnings over the last couple of years in my time on the board, the players have never offended again. Mm-hmm. The scenarios have never reappeared. And, if I leave you with one lasting legacy on rule breaking, is you never want to be remembered for the rules you break. But unfortunately, that's a more lasting legacy than playing by the rules. Mm-hmm. So don't break the rules to the point where people remember it, because it's amazing how high profile it becomes.
Sure, absolutely. I must ask you as well, Andrew, something we haven't spoken about, the touch roll. Now, I know they have this in chess. What do you think about that as a potential new rule?
I've been a long an advocate that we need to have the rule in backgammon, whether it's for shuffling, whether it's the doubling dice, whether it's just the physicality, in my mind, of bringing a skill level mentally to the game that is slightly removed by being able to move your checkers to actually physically see the position rather than visualize it. But as a tournament director, unequivocally, it would transform the ease for me to run a tournament. I think in the short term, it will be a disaster because people's habits will break in and it will be very hard to get out of the old habit of touching the checkers with not knowing the intention has to be then to move it. But I would love to bring it in. I'd be a massive advocate.
And would you like to plug any future backgammon events as you're on the channel?
No, listen, I think you know me well enough. No, I mean, at Backgammon London, for anyone that comes to London, just look at our backgammonlondon.com site. We're very fortunate because we obviously have a very large playing community. I know, Daniel, you're going to join us at the Players in November. We've been very fortunate to procure the Pall Mall RAC Club in May for the London Open. That will probably be the most prestigious venue Backgammon has ever had in the UK for a significant event. I'm pleased to say there'll be both intermediate and masters there, which is wonderful. So all ends of the game will get the value of playing in such a wonderful setting. No, for me, I think, it's putting something into the game that has a legacy and will last. We're moving forward quite quickly and efficiently now with the junior side of things. As you saw, we had the first inaugural junior and youth competition at the UK Open. There are some really meaningful things about to happen within the UKBGF, again for clubs and memberships for next year. So, no, for me, plugging the events, I'm fortunate London politely sells itself, but I love the fact that members come from all over the country to play in them. And I hope if there's one thing that people will get at our events, which I think you get at most of them, is that actually, for all the seriousness and underlying commentary of today, they're fun. Yeah. They're a social aspect.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Yeah. When we're playing, play with a serious face. Backgammon requires huge concentration during a game, and you should never take it personally if your opponent doesn't talk to you during a game. Feels like they're so focused on it that they've lost all common courtesy. Far from it. It just takes a hell of a lot of concentration. It really does. And if there are two differences between players across the board that will win more than they'll lose, it will be maintaining that level of concentration, especially through the distractions that go on in a big room with lots of people.
You see headphone wearers,
Absolutely. And using their time. We joke, but the rules breaking, the premature rolling, so much of what we're talking about is because people move and act in over haste in backgammon. There is no rush. Yeah. There's far more time than people are ever going to recognize. You could count on your hand for most top players the matches where they've run out of time. You just use it. Enjoy the time. Think about it. Think about your actions. We say take personal responsibility. That's just through pausing, inhaling, and taking time. It will transform your game. It really will, because all of us are at fault for playing too quickly. The internet has only accelerated that.
I remember when I started playing with a clock, and I was somewhat nervous, many years ago. But I always ended with like 7 minutes on the clock. Yeah. So there's more time than you realise. And, you are allowed to wear headphones at tournaments. you are allowed to have a glass of water or even a coffee as long as you don't spill it on your opponent's Jeffrey Parker board. That's
that could be expensive.
Yeah. Also, the UKBGF, let me mention, it's a fabulous institution. You can become a member. Go onto their website. They will tell you about all the future backgammon events, backgammon clubs. There's a lot of learning content on there. There's a ratings list. There's just a lot of good stuff that people work really hard to maintain. So do become a member. It's very cheap. I mean, how much now is it, Andrew, to become a member?
£25 a year or £60 for a 3-year commitment.
Okay, and you also get discounts, don't you, on XG? I think as a member.
Oh, across the way. I mean, if you play my London events, aside from the offering of the free online league, all my events offer a £5 discount to members. So for those fortunate enough to be in London around me, your membership is actually free by the end of the year. But at other clubs, and there are lots of incentives thrown in. There are tournament prizes added into all the UKBGF Tour events. There's the Tour Winners Invitational, which you've qualified for next year. So hopefully, slowly but surely, the members' money, because it's a non-profit making association, gets reinvested back into the membership. And I think across the board, it only brings good things generally. Everything has its failings and will learn from its mistakes, I hope. The UKBGF is no different. There have been recent things that have happened that will only serve to remind us that we're all fallible, we all make mistakes. But more importantly, we're a community. Tournament directors, players, UKBGF. And UKBG Backgammon is a shining light around the world. They marvel at the level of people that play in every one of our events, the strength of our membership, the 800, 900 people across the board that are playing in our online leagues, the rules that we've created. We really are a flag bearer for backgammon generally. We have a lot to be proud of. And the things we highlight are very small examples of instances where failings have happened. That's human nature. Backgammon teaches you one thing: it's about human nature and the ability to deal with adversity, bad luck, good luck, humility. It really is a lesson in life. It really is, and I think that's what draws us all to it. And it's you've got to take the rough with the smooth. It's just a wonderful experience. But embrace it. Don't get upset by it. Don't get frustrated by it. That's the nature of the game.
Absolutely. Well, Andrew, it's been a pleasure. Thank you for coming on my channel. I hope you found that useful as an audience. I will put a link into the video description and also a link to the UKBGF as well, should you not be a member already. Andrew, see you at the next tournament.
I will see you in November.
Take care. Goodbye.
God bless all.
See you later.